This episode is brought to you by HASA. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the Bottom Feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about undersized pool equipment, old equipment, things of that nature that really make your job really difficult out there. I'll go over some tips to deal with pools with smaller equipment, and of course, ways to convince customers to possibly upgrade their equipment pad. Join the Pool Guy coaching program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support from me. I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. And I'll start with this, that I think the best way to get the customer to update their equipment is to offer them a package deal and a discount. And I'm not one to say that all discounts are bad and that, they're something that you shouldn't do because you're leaving money on the table. Yes, I get it that if you discount multiple equipment installs at the same time, there is some money left on the table. But in the other side of that coin is the fact that you're updating this pool that you've been struggling with. It may be a good account, they may pay on time, and it may be a fairly small pool, but the equipment is the problem. And so what I would suggest is offering them a percentage off the price if they get a new pump and filter installed, and you'll take care of that at a price that is discounted. I don't know how much you want to take off. It just depends on yourself and your business model. But there's been times where I've taken off $300 on the install because I wanted just to upgrade this thing for them. You could take $200 off. You can do something just to get the customer motivated to update their pad. And sometimes you even get lucky and you're able to upsell them a saltwater system or something of that nature. They may break open the piggy bank at that time, noting that you're giving them a discount on some of the other things. They may want to upgrade more things. So that's something that is to be considered, is that if you do offer a package, filter and pump, you may get the customer to make a move in that regard. Sometimes that does nothing and doesn't really move the needle. And then there's options for that pool, and I'll address that a little bit later, some of those options. But one of the problems that you run into out there when you get a service account is that the equipment is undersized and sometimes really old and ancient. And you wonder sometimes, well, you don't wonder too much why the other pool service quit on them and why you got this account. But you do wonder how you're going to maintain this pool through the season with what you got. And so there's a few examples I'll give you of pools that I've taken over. One of them in particular was a pretty good sized pool. There was no spa attached to it, but it was just a pool. It was much older and it had a 36 square foot. I've had actually a few of these 36 square foot DE filters on my route. It's a pretty dinky filter, really. It takes you like 5 minutes to clean it because it's so tiny. But having one of these on a large pool is a problem because you have to backwash it. I was backwashing this filter at least once a month, maybe sometimes more, and taking it apart every 3 months because it was so small that it would just not be efficient for this size pool. And the customer had just bought the house and he brought me on for service and I started servicing the pool. I'm not sure what happens to the other pool guy, but the pool was a constant struggle. There was algae in the pool. It didn't look great. And the filter was just way too small and truthfully way too old for that pool. And I gave him the option of replacing the grids, which weren't super expensive because they're, again, 36 square feet grids were pretty affordable. And so I gave him a bid for that. But I really tried to get him to change the filter. And they wouldn't budge. They were like, no, I mean, we got to do other work on the house. And so, this seemed like the pool was okay with the filter. We'll keep it for a while longer. So I put new grids in there. That did help a little bit, but it was still a struggle. And there was some times when I thought maybe, I don't want to do this account because of this problem, but it was an easy pool because, it just was a pool and it stayed pretty clean. It just had circulation problems because of that small filter. And this was over 20,000 gallons with this little filter. It was built back in the 70s, and so large filters weren't something, it was kind of hit and miss back then. Sometimes the pool had a gigantic filter. Sometimes they had these little dinky filters on them. And here in California, we rarely would have, or at least in my area of Los Angeles County, we rarely have a single bullet cartridge filter, 150, 200 square foot cartridge filter here. All these filters that we have here in my area are larger, 400 square feet, 500 square feet cartridge filters, 60 square foot D filters. There's not too many sand filters, but if you run into one here in LA County, you're going to have a, 400 pound sand filter or 300 pound sand filter. So we do have big filters, and it's something that's more common than these little tiny dinky filters, but they're still out there, and you're still going to run into pools that have really small and outdated filters. This pump was also pretty old, and when the motor finally died on it, I convinced them at this point, this was like a year and a half into doing the pool. I got through the summer season and I was entering another summer, and it's one of those things where this is not going to work. I'm not going to be able to go through another season with this filter and this really old pump and motor. And so I did make him a package deal with a clean and clear 420 square foot cartridge filter and a new. And the Pool Guy Podcast Show has teamed up with UPA to bring you affordable, reliable liability insurance starting at just $64 a month. Get up to $2 million in coverage, and the members of my coaching group get an even lower rate. Protect your business and your peace of mind. Sign up with UPA today by clicking the link in the podcast description. Pump, and it's one of those things where it's almost like the pool got a new lease on life. It was so much easier to maintain it with the new equipment. It ran so much better. It just became a whole new service account at that point. And so that's something to consider when you're trying to kind of limp through these pools with the old filters and the old pumps, is that once you do change it, it takes that account to a whole new level, and you may, try to force their hand sometimes because on the other side of things, you're going to have this sweet account once it's finished because you're going to have the right size equipment and it's going to be running smoothly. And a lot of these old pools with these old equipment pads, at least in my area, are pretty nice pools. They don't get a lot of debris in there. You really couldn't maintain it if it was a pool that got trashed every week by debris. So a lot of these are older pools built in the 70s and 80s that have a lot of cement decking with very little trees or leaf debris that gets in these pools. So they're actually pretty easy pools once they have the right equipment. And it's one of those things where you're motivated as the pool service provider. I think you're more motivated than the customer is to replace this equipment. Sometimes an added challenge to an old equipment pad is that even an automatic cleaner is not working effectively, like a suction side cleaner. I've had this problem where if the pool pump is really old and the motor is really old, not necessarily undersized, but old, and there's an air leak or something somewhere, and you're trying to connect a suction side cleaner to it, it's just not going to work. The problem with these older pumps and motors, especially if there's an air leak somewhere in the system, and usually it's around the pump and motor area, and the customer is not super motivated to really do anything at their equipment pad. And I found this to be true. You take over a pool that's really old, and they have old Ortega valves, and you give them a bid to change out these valves to Jandy valves, or there's an air leak somewhere and you're trying to get the customer to fix it, and they're usually very reluctant to do anything because they're fine with their equipment pad the way it is and they don't want to spend any money. And you will have customers like this out there. There's a percentage of customers that just won't consider their pool as something that needs any kind of attention. They don't use the pool, they don't like the pool, and so the last thing they want to do is spend money on anything that they have to deal with the pool itself. So I've had on occasion a few of these where even the suction cleaner is not working because there's some kind of air leak or it's just inefficient, and it's just not able to power the suction side cleaner, which is another added layer of frustration because I really like having all my pools with automatic cleaners. It just makes my job easier. And in some cases, you can't even manual vacuum some of these old pools because their systems just don't have what it takes to pull the water into them. I come from an era where there's a lot of brass motors and pumps, not motors per se, but brass pumps. And these have very little power to begin with. And so if you try to manual vacuum one of these pools with a brass pump and you have 50 feet of pool hose and you're trying to pull it through there with this old system, you're going at a snail's pace in a lot of cases. So that's another added problem, is that even maintaining the pools with the old equipment is a difficulty because you can't properly vacuum it. And I just tell the customer flat out, your pool equipment is so old and ineffective that I'm not going to be able to maintain the pool in the way that I normally do. So just be aware that even if I do manual vacuum the pool, it's not going to look as good. And you really want to consider replacing your equipment at this point, because I can't really maintain the pool at the level that I want to, or that you may desire me to. And that may move the needle at some point, and you just have to keep on the customer, and it becomes almost like a dripping faucet. You just keep telling them every time you can, hey, your equipment, I'm having trouble maintaining the pool in June because you're getting some algae here, and you have an undersized filter, and you have a pump that's not working effectively. Just be aware that I'm going to charge you for this algicide treatment, and I'm going to charge you for extra shock for your pool to maintain it. This dripping faucet approach really is effective because what's the worst that can happen? They can cancel your service, and then you're off the hook with this pool that you didn't really like that much anyway. So to me, it's not a bad thing to be constantly reminding the customer and being on them about their pump and filter being inefficient for the pool. And again, the worst case is like, hey, you know what? I don't really like the fact you keep asking me every month to change my equipment, or every 2 months. So I'm going to get someone else to take care of the pool. That's perfectly fine at that point. But the dripping faucet method does work. You're going to eventually wear them down. They're going to get to a point where they're like, well, the pool guy is telling us every week might be too much, every other month or every month that, we need new equipment and he's having trouble with the pool. Maybe we should look into getting new equipment. Because I find that if you don't ask and you don't make it a point to bring it up to the customer as often as you need to bring it up, they're going to think there's no problem. It's just like anything else. If you don't mention it, then they're really going to think there's no problem with the pool at that point. And this is something that you have to really make an effort to do, is that whenever you see them out there in the backyard, call them over to the equipment and say, hey, look, let me show you something real quick. You see this here? This is just not efficient, and I've told you this before. And now that you're here, I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna be cleaning the filter today, and I'm gonna take it apart and show you, what's in here. And this is kind of like a good psychological thing too, especially if it's a DE filter. When you take it apart in front of them and show them like the grids covered with dirt and algae residue, and they're swimming in that, they'll be like, wow, that's really bad. What can you do about it? Well, I could put a 400 square foot cartridge filter in, and it'll really maintain the pool better, and you won't have as much junk in the filter. You don't have to explain to them that a lot of the gunk on the grids is actually diatomaceous earth covered with the slime from the pool and the dead algae and the dirt. Basically, you're using a visual aid to show them that this filter needs to be replaced. And this is something that's even better if there's tears in the grids or if there's a problem with the filter. Sometimes you'll have a filter that's so old that it's even hard to clean properly. If you have an old 2000 series Pentair filter, over time that lid gets warped from being blown off all the time by the pool pro. And it's one of those things where even with the new O-ring all the time, you may have a drip leak. And there's times when the filter is just so old that your supplier doesn't even you have a hard time finding parts for it, like O-rings and different things. So at that point, there is something to push the customer to change it out. And again, offering them a discount of some kind sometimes is enough to motivate them to do that. I've had to fall on the sword sometimes and put a used filter into customers that just didn't want to buy a new one. And whenever I cut out a filter that's fairly decent, I'll save it in my backyard area. And then I've installed used filters before. It's not the end of the world. It's not something that I like to do, but it's something that sometimes has to be done where some of these customers that just won't move for a new filter, but a bigger filter is going to help a lot. So what exactly is an undersized filter in my opinion? Well, in Florida, I know a lot of the pools there run off of a 150 or 200 square foot cartridge filter. That just doesn't work too well in my area because there's a lot of dust in my area, a lot of dirt when the winds blow, and the pools are fairly large here, 15,000, maybe even 20,000 gallons in some cases, but typically the average size pool here is about 15,000 gallons. There's some smaller ones, and I wouldn't put in anything smaller than a 400 square foot cartridge filter now in my area. You can get away with maybe a 300 square foot cartridge filter, but nothing smaller. If I'm going with a D filter, I would put nothing in smaller than 60 square feet. And then if you wanted to go to a larger D filter, the quad type D filters are great. I would go with a 80 or 100 square foot quad type D filter. And bigger is definitely better in my area. If you want to go with a sand filter, which is really uncommon in my area, again, 300 or 400 pound sand filter would probably be sufficient. So nothing below 60 square foot for DE, and really nothing below 350 square foot or 360. I think 320, I should say, is the smallest cartridge filter I would go with. There's some Hayward filters that actually are like 280 square foot or 240. Probably wouldn't do that for the quad type cartridge filters. And I should emphasize that all these filters I'm talking about are the quad type, except for maybe the exception of the larger Aquastar pipeline filter. That one is kind of comparable to a 250, 300 square foot cartridge filter. But I would say the bigger the filter, the better. And I know in Florida, you kind of limp through your season with these smaller cartridge filters. It wouldn't be a bad idea to start selling customers if the pad has the space for it. These quad type cartridge filters, you're cleaning them a lot less every 6 months or so, and you're able to maintain the pool much better. The flow is going to be tremendously better. You notice that right away. As far as pumps go, you can live with a small pump if it's operating correctly. I've had several accounts where the builder went really cheap on the customer without the customer really knowing, I don't think, and they put a 3/4 horsepower whisper flow pump in, or they put a super flow pump in, a 1 horsepower, which is pretty weak because it doesn't have a lot of head power. And the pool runs fairly good with those pumps. I wouldn't say that a smaller horsepower pump is necessarily bad. I've had pools with, again, 3/4 horsepower pumps that work effectively, but it's the older pumps that are the problem. The Duraglass or the Maxiglass pumps that are just barely hanging on. Maybe an old brass pump that's still on your route. A really old, Pentair Purex pump is the problem as well. For some reason, a lot of those get air in the system, and it's just hard to maintain the pool with those. So not necessarily an undersized pump, because truthfully, I've had pools with small pumps that work well. It's just those old pumps that don't work effectively they have to replace. So keep an eye on those older pumps, and I would definitely replace those pumps that seem to be pretty ancient out there with a newer pump. Not necessarily a high horsepower VS pump, but a newer pump or a new pump would be in order in a lot of cases. So the best sales technique, again, is just to be that dripping faucet. Always bring it up to the customer that their equipment has a problem, you're having a hard time maintaining the pool, and they need to upgrade. And then the last option is to, of course, drop the pool and move on at that point. It's not a terrible thing if you have to drop a pool because the equipment is ineffective or not functioning well. Sometimes it's a bummer because you like the account, but if push comes to shove and you just can't maintain that pool and you're wasting time out there, because time is money, and you're spending more time on this pool to try to just do the basic things like vacuum it, I would say it's time to approach the customer one last time. And if they are not going to move on it, I would suggest just dropping the account and replacing it with something that's much better, and it's not going to waste your time and effort and mental power. I mean, because you're stressing over it, you're fighting this thing, and sometimes it's not a battle worth fighting in some cases. If you're looking for other podcasts that I have, you can find those on my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. On the banner, there's a podcast icon. Click on that, and there'll be a drop down menu of other podcasts for you. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Also, if you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you'll get a podcast sent to you Monday through Friday. So So those are all different ways to receive the podcast. And again, if you're interested in the coaching program, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week. God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.